Welcome to Prescribing Prosperity with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos from MedWealth Financial Services, operating through IPC Securities Corporation. In this podcast, we provide unique insights into wealth management, the psychology of financial decisions, and help listeners place the capital markets into perspective. Our aim is to help physicians, business owners, and other medical professionals to live their dream. Life is to live and enjoy, so we'll also cover health and lifestyle-related topics such as food, dining, travel, and unique experiences. Learn how global trends shape our investment strategy as we help you assemble your roadmap to prosperity.
Hello, and welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity podcast with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos. Gentlemen, good to see you again.
Hi, Bill. Nice to see you,
John.
Bill.
Hey, Alex. Looking forward to today because our last episode, you spoke about the Canadian healthcare system. These next two episodes, you're going to take on a topic which is equally important because it touches each and every aspect of everybody who lives in Canada, and that is the economy. To help sift through this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Kim Moody. Kim is a CPA. He is the founder and director of Moody's Private Client and Moody's Tax, a premier Canadian tax law and accounting firm. He's also an Amazon best-selling author, and he is one of the preeminent thought leaders on public policy in Canada and is a regular contributor to the Financial Post. Kim, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the kind intro.
You're quite welcome. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And with that, I'll let John get this interview started.
Well, this is the first time I'm meeting Kim virtually. We have not met in person. I came across Kim's work on the internet. I was not available to review the most recent Canadian budget that came down, and the next morning I was scrambling to find some analysis, and I did a search and I came across Kim's writing, and the first paragraph or two, I thought, this guy knows what he's talking about, and I was very impressed. So Kim, can you start off by walking us through your career journey and explain how you became an important public policy commentator?
Sure. Thanks, John. How far do you want me to go back? Do you want me to go back to my year of birth, or
I think 25 or so should be good.
Well, maybe I'll just take it back to when I became a CPA. I was always interested in tax and specifically tax advisory as opposed to tax returns, and started my own firm with a colleague of mine in 1994. So very quickly after I got my CA, and that was, in hindsight, pretty naive because the idea was that I was going to be a tax guy and my partner was going to be a valuation and M&A guy. And I quickly realized that, holy cow, I knew nothing about tax, even though I was a CPA. And so I had to surround myself with mentors and quickly learn. And what I learned throughout my journey is that there's a lot of people who think they know tax, but the amount of people that actually do know tax and can practice it at a specialist level is very, very tiny in Canada. And the other thing I learned throughout my career, which I brought to what I wanted to build with Moody's Tax, Moody's Private Client, was, there's a lot of BS out there. There's a lot of just trumpeting the government line. Like in this recent budget, as a quick example, with the capital gains inclusion rate, apparently it only impacts 0.13% of Canadian taxpayers. What a bunch of horse shit. Am I allowed to say that, by the way?
Yeah, you can
Absolutely.
say it. Absolutely. We echo your sentiments.
And so my philosophy throughout was that, you know what, I don't want to be a little fish amongst a whole bunch of little fish in a giant pond, because there's lots of people that will parrot the government lines because they don't want to say anything that will be, air quotes, controversial,
Right.
or God forbid, blow through the smoke and tell it what it is. So the philosophy was that we're going to help our clients, which is private clients exclusively, high net worth, ultra high net worth private clients, and we're going to tell them what government policy means. And when we first started doing that, my colleagues and I first started doing that, we were kind of vilified by our peers, but I couldn't care less. I
Good for
really
you.
couldn't care less. And so we kept pushing forward despite some of the headwinds, and fast forward now a couple decades later, and I think for the most part we're well respected within government, and they certainly don't like us at some point, but we're well respected for telling it like it is, and dealing with them, and more appropriately and more importantly, our audience of our clients and our center of influences and referral sources really do look to our firm and myself to tell them what this really means. And so that's been my career journey. So it's been fun, and I continue to do it. So,
well, Kim, thank you for that. And I just want to reflect on your first major point about how few accountants actually know the tax act in intricate detail. I think that applies to a lot of different professions. It applies to the investment industry. It applies to the medical profession. Even though people are trained in their particular profession, few actually engage in what I call outside the box or higher level thinking as far as it's the subject matter is concerned. And good for you for taking a more objective perspective of tax policy, because we certainly don't need an echo chamber in any government. We need someone that's going to come in and blow a strong wind and clear out the fog and tell it like it is. So I really appreciate your perspective. I want to start off by asking you, excuse me, a little bit about our current tax system and how it ranks relative to our peers. And when I say ranks, I'm speaking, of course, about its competitiveness. And you can address both at the individual and at the corporate level.
Sure. I mean, that's a pretty broad-based question, but I'll tackle it from a high level here, because I could answer that question from a whole bunch of different perspectives. It could be from a rate perspective, which on personal rates and corporate rates, especially personal rates, our rates rank very high as compared to the OECD average. I wrote about this in my one of my Financial Post weekly pieces, because I do write weekly for the Financial Post. And in January, the first week in January of this year, 2024, I wrote a comparative piece about, if you lived in Florida and or California, which Florida is a low state tax and California is high, and you earn the same income, ignoring foreign currency, and you compare that to an Alberta-based resident or an Ontario-based resident, what's the differences? And if you look at that article, the differences are it's quite different. And I use a bunch of different assumptions and income for various scenarios, but I can tell you we're not competitive on a personal tax rate basis. Corporately, we're better, especially in my home province of Alberta. Our high corporate rate is 23%, which is nice and competitive, especially to the United States, where we compete nicely. But overall, our tax system is, on a rate basis, is simply not competitive. Our GST system it's a pretty good system. And frankly, in my view, it's the most fair tax that we have, consumption tax.
Agreed.
But having said that, it's overall, if you just look at our personal and corporate rates, we're just not competitive, and it's really, really time for a review. I don't think we're going to get a comprehensive review given our political environment, but even if we got a limited form review with some obvious changes such as rates and increased consumption tax, et cetera, would be better than what we have today.
So Kim, there are some people listening to this podcast right now who are going to be saying, well, it's important that people who earn a lot of money pay their fair share of taxes. And why is competitive corporate and individual tax rates so important, not just for high income individuals, but also for the rest of the population?
Again, that's a pretty broad question there. John, you seem to like these broad questions.
I just want to give you lots of flexibility. So
which is good.
You choose your path.
Well, I thought you would kind of ask me that question, so I came prepared.
Okay, good.
Especially in this environment with respect to the capital gains inclusion rate of, the April 16th budget, where they did that under the auspices of taxing the rich just a little bit more. So they pulled out that old classic card again. And so I'm going to test you here. I'm going to turn the tables around on you, John and Alex.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, in 2020, I wrote about this in October of 2023 in my Financial Post article, and it's also on my website. But these statistics are easily available. But what do you think the top 0.1% of income tax filers earned in 2020, which is the latest stats available? At least I should double check, actually, because there might be more stats, but I doubt it. What do you think they earned? The top 0.1%.
I would say 250 and above.
That's a little light. So just to put this in perspective, Canada has roughly I'll round it, roughly 29 million taxpayers. Our population now is roughly 41 million, which is a story in and of itself. But
yes,
but we have roughly 29 million taxpayers. So the top 0.1% represents 2,885 taxpayers. They earned 2,829,000 or more. Wow. So it's a very tiny group, right? 2,825 out of 29 million, roughly. So how much do you think they paid in overall personal tax, both federally and provincially?
Are you talking on a percentage basis?
On a percentage basis, yeah.
Well, I would say 53.53 is not that.
No, he's saying of the overall tax base.
Of the overall.
I was going to say that group probably is responsible for about 15% of the overall tax revenue.
It's a little bit high, but when you think about it, it's 1/100th of 1%.
Right.
Which is a very, very tiny population.
Right.
They paid 2.6% of all of Canada's tax revenues, personally and provincially, or federally and provincially.
So they're paying disproportionately more tax than other taxpayers.
Completely. Now let's just ratchet up the chain a little bit here. Now let's go to the top 1%. That represents a pool of course, 100 times more than the previous group. And it's 288,400 taxpayers. And that represents that pool of people earns $253,900 or more.
I think that's the number I was focused on when you asked the first time. I was on 1%, not 0.1.
Yeah, 0.01, by the way, was the previous one.
Right. Okay.
So now I'm going to stop there before I give you the answer in terms of how much the top 1% pay as a percentage of the overall. But to me, I find that shocking that the top 1% only earn 253,000. One would think, if you believe, the tax the rich mantra, that Canada has a lot of so-called rich people. Actually, we don't. That number is shockingly low.
Yeah.
But they paid 21.1% of all tax revenues.
Yeah.
That to me is shocking, right? Now let's keep going. The top 5%, which is about 1.4 million taxpayers, and they earned only 132,000, paid 40.1%. That's the top 5% of income earners paid 40%. Now the top 10%, which represents 2.9 million taxpayers, earned only 102,000, but they paid 53% of all revenues. Now think about this for a second. That, by extension, the bottom 50%, which represents which represents roughly 14.4 million taxpayers, earned $40,700 or less, and they only paid 6.5%. Now, I'm all for a progressive tax system, right? So, am I advocating for a shift to that bottom 50%? Not really. But I'd like to dig into it and see how much of that is being subsidized by the rich, so-called rich. And the answer is obvious, right? It's heavily, heavily subsidized, which is the basic elements of a progressive tax system. But what I'm trying to point out here is for people that like to pull out the tax the rich card, especially the young, and especially the people that don't understand tax, and especially the people that have already made their money and decide that they're going to be left of center fiscalists. And I'm happy to pay more tax. Yeah, shut up. That is.
I'm glad you are. Go ahead.
So, Kim, that's an interesting comment you just made. What I find when I'm speaking with my clients is I do a what if scenario with them. And I asked them, I said, let's assume for a moment there was no income tax levied in Canada. It's 0% income taxes. How much would you volunteer from your annual income to pay to the government to support services? What percentage? Guess what the answer is most often?
Zero.
Zero. On
But
occasion, you'll get someone who says 10%. The highest I've ever had a response from is 25%. Yet our marginal tax rate's 53.53. And I think the average tax rate, correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, is somewhere in the range of 35 to 40%.
yeah, those are roughly in the neighborhood. So just to respond to that, the reason why a lot of people would respond zero, I think, is twofold. One, they don't understand tax. There's no straight line connection in terms of what they're paying for. For a guy like me, though, I wouldn't answer zero. And frankly, I don't know what I would answer. I'd have to think about that. But I can tell you, it certainly wouldn't be at the rate that I'm paying today. And why? Because for me, it's a value proposition. What am I getting for my money?
Exactly.
You know, I have no problem. And frankly, I'm happy to pay to the extent that my government provides infrastructure, roads, hospitals, education for my kids. That is, I could go on in education. I don't want, what I mean by education is not indoctrination. I want education.
Yes.
Right.
Classical
And
education.
Exactly. And then secondly, I want to make sure that the people that can't provide for themselves are well taken care of, or at least have a basic means, you know, old age security for the elderly that don't have any income, people that just can't get a job because of mental health issues or physical disabilities or what have you, that they're provided for. I have no problem with paying for that, none. And frankly, I think a good society needs that. But when you're spending money on ridiculous progressive crap, then all of a sudden I think, what? I don't want my money going to this progressive crap. And why are we shooting off money overseas?
Yeah.
You know, to and that's a lot of money. And why are we spending money on electric battery subsidies, you know, electric vehicle subsidies? We're up to approaching 50 billion or more of subsidies, which is a tremendous amount of money for a small country like ours. And are you telling me we're spending $56 billion on public debt charges, which is the amount that we're spending, or sorry, collecting on net GST annually? Really? Now I have a problem, right? Now all of a sudden my radar says, no, I'm going to pay something. I want to pay something significantly less. So that's my, you know, response to your question, John. It's a value proposition in many cases, and right now, I don't feel like I'm getting good value for my money.
Well, and I also get rankled by the notion that or this whole narrative that the rich need to pay their fair share. Who's to say what the fair share is? That is a very open-ended and subjective connotation. What's your definition of fair share? For somebody who's at the highest marginal tax rate in this country, they're already giving up more than 50% of their income. Is that not enough? Like how much more do you need to bleed them to death?
That. Can I respond to that, Alex?
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, this is not a new issue, right? It's been around forever. And frankly, in my world, you know, one of the classic documents that I go back to is the so-called Royal Commission. It's not so-called, it is the Royal Commission on Taxation, which is the so-called Carter Commission, which was commenced in 1962 by then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who took a big political risk to do this. And then it ended in 1966, 4 years to study Canada's tax system and recommend tax recommendations to improve Canada. That document and recommendations has aged very, very nicely. One of the classic comments in that document, and by the way, that it's a 6-volume set. It's it's very, very voluminous in terms of its recommendations and report. But one of the things it said is that the average man back then, it was okay to say, man instead of, so, but the average man should not be taxed more than 50% because there's a psychological barrier and behavioral response that to the extent that you take more than 50% of a person's income, that can have significant behavioral consequences. And I think that classic statement holds true today. And so, Alex, to your point, I trumpet that line quite often by the Carter Commission because it's true. It was true then, it's true today. But unfortunately, in recent years, under this current government, they had no problem exceeding that and just ignoring that warning. And
Right.
frankly, the ignorance of not adhering to that good recommendation is that we're seeing a lot of Canadians, successful Canadians, responding to that. I have a piece in the Financial Post that I wrote yesterday and today, and it'll be published tomorrow, about that very behavioral consequence of ignorant tax policy.
How many people are leaving the country, Kim?
I don't know the answer to that because the statistics aren't available, but I can tell you through my practice and certainly a lot of my peers across Canada, it's a significant amount. I tell the story quite often that in the first 23 years of my practice, I had maybe a dozen departure tax files, dozen. And it was all related to lifestyle. Grandma and grandpa had their nest egg and they want to go live somewhere warmer or go closer to their grandkids. And typically they're going to the United States, typically, not always, but typically. So I had about a dozen of those files. When Trudeau came to power and the first thing he did was increase the tax rate by 4%, that set off a whole significant behavioral response. Fast forward to 2017, the attack on small businesses, and then fast forward to COVID, massive spending, threats of a wealth tax, blah, blah, blah.
Digital
the wealthy,
IDs and
yeah,
whatnot.
just a bunch of stuff, right? My file count so far, within the last 5 years, it wasn't huge in 2016 when the tax rates went up, but it was certainly more than a dozen files. But today, I would say we're well over 600 files.
Wow.
That we've worked on. Now, not
And that's
all
just
of
your
those
practice.
that's just my practice, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, not all of those, to be fair, have pulled the trigger, but they have certainly, wanted us to tell them and help them understand what it takes. I would say of the people that actually pulled the trigger, and I'm just guessing here, but it's certainly in the neighborhood of probably 7 to somewhere north of, it's probably in the $7 to $9 billion range of wealth that's left Canada just through our office.
Yeah.
And, and it continues, especially after the crazy capital gains inclusion rate. So long-winded response.
Yeah. So getting back to your earlier point about the number of tax filers earning a high level of income, that small number that paid disproportionately more taxes than the rest of the population is now shrinking in size.
Yes.
And so inevitably, to generate the same tax revenue, the government's going to have to move down the scale of income earners to extract more blood in order to continue to pay for these progressive strategies that are not necessarily an efficient spending of taxpayer dollars.
Completely. And the capital gains inclusion rate is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
I mean, they came out with this messaging that it's 0.13%, but that's total bullshit. So just think about it this way. So you have a public company that earns income, and part of that income might be a capital gain. Well, right away, they've got a corporate tax rate increase. And if they're a dividend paying company, which there's many of them in Canada that pay dividends to their shareholders, is there more or less money available to pay to their shareholders? Well, there's going to be less, of course, right? And so who owns a lot of these dividend paying stocks? Well, pension holders or average Canadians through their non-registered accounts. And so pension holders, who in many cases are not high income earning Canadians, are going to receive less dividends over time because of that capital gains inclusion rate. It's just common sense.
Yeah.
And so to suggest that, it's only 0.13% is purposely misleading at best, but blatantly disingenuous. And, it's something like that, for example, that If you just use your head a little bit, you'll recognize that that's, like you said, John, pushing the tax burden down the chain, or sorry, down to the bottom. That's a easy way to do it.
Kim, the other implication of raising corporate income taxes, of course, is the corporation has less money for labor. And so you get an uptick in unemployment from that very act. And you also have the situation where now, due to corporate rates being higher, you're not as competitive. And so what incentive would foreign capital have to come to this country and be hit with all these taxes at the corporate level? And you know, you listen to Kevin O'Leary speak about this subject matter, and he says, you know, I run venture capital companies, and nobody wants to come to Canada.
Yeah, and he's bang on, and there's been a lot of people like him that have been raising the alarm bell, and rightly so, especially to push back at some of the so-called academic experts, the economists and the academics who say, you know, this is the best of the, you know, worst alternative, or which, to respond to that would be, hold on a second here, you tell me that's the only alternative to deal with our productivity and our deficits? How about reduce spending?
Yeah, no kidding.
That would be probably the best of a bad alternative, instead of raising capital gains inclusion rates. So I have no time for shallowness like that that's put out by academics without doing the whole picture.
Well,
and I challenge them.
I also, one of my, I play hockey on Fridays, and one of the guys that I played hockey with, the subject came up, and he goes, it's not even that much that they're increasing it. And I bit my tongue, because I was ready to, I was ready, you know what, it's not worth getting into it with some of those guys, but it just, my blood pressure went through the roof, because, and this is something that has been a bone of mine, a bone of contention for me for a long time. People have this irrational perspective when they think about corporations. I prepped you on a question for this, Kim, but you know, the way I liken it to is, people imagine Scrooge McDuck sitting on these mountains of gold coins and surfing up and down them, and sitting inside of a vault inside of a big, huge office building. And that's what they think corporations are. When the reality is, the corporations are nothing more than a legal construct. They are a construct that ties together a group of products or services and says, this is our product or service that we sell to the public. And that's all they are. So the notion that they are somehow this greedy individual sitting on the sidelines just hoarding money is completely irrational and makes no sense whatsoever. Because, as my dad mentioned, you go ahead and you start increasing the amount of taxes that they have to pay. Not only do they have no incentive to do business in your country, they also have fewer resources with which they can either employ people, they can return capital to the shareholders, they have less money available for them to reinvest to grow the company, so the company can't become more developed and grow the economy by producing better or different goods and services that create new jobs and create new value for the economy. And so it drives me nuts when people go out there and have these obscene perspectives.
Essentially, companies are economic conduits. You can tax them all you want. They're not going to pay a dime in tax, because they're going to pass through the cost in the form, as Kim said, fewer dividends being paid out, fewer employees, and no capital expenditures to increase the size of the business. So it's a waste of time to do this. Not to mention, well, we've already mentioned it, you get the situation where you're getting executives and other high net worth business owners fleeing the country. So
totally.
It's not a good situation. I mean, there's a guy who's making a living on YouTube called Nomad Capitalist. And this guy is showing Canadians and other people from the United States and different jurisdictions about how they can move to jurisdictions where they're treated best from a tax perspective. And so we don't live in the confines of a country. We live on the planet Earth, and there are other jurisdictions that are prepared to treat you more fairly.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Alex, can I respond to your hockey player situation?
You can absolutely, Kim.
You want to come to the dressing room?
Yeah, we play Fridays at 4 o'clock. You're welcome to come in and correct a few people.
Well, just pay my airfare, and I'll be happy to be the stick boy for that day. So I find, and this is way too simplistic, but just for illustration, I find that people like that, that say, tax the rich, or companies are like Scrooge McDuck, sitting on a pile of cash. A lot of those people are just simply uneducated. And as soon as you educate them and show them, there is a glimmer of hope that you'll be able to show them the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But, that's the one hand. The other extreme is people that are just so ideologically driven that they don't give a shit about the truth. They're either going to hang on to their partisan, like the liberals, for example, they'll vote liberal no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Perspectives, thank you. Or, they're just so ideologically driven that they don't care about facts. And I find that two ends of the extreme tend to be the case. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the mushy middle, which is where you want to be, you want to be in typically, so that ultimately you can hear both sides of the equation and understand it better and then educate yourself. Unfortunately, mm-hmm. with polarization today, proliferated by social media, etc., and frankly, our government by promoting division and divisiveness, it's hard. I'll give you an example. So I got 4 sons. They don't usually like me talking about them too much, but I think it's pretty safe ground here. I'm going to guess they're not going to listen to your podcast. So
you got to change that, though, Kim. You got to encourage them.
I might have to, but they get tired of me ranting and raving, right? And yes, Dad, we know how you feel. Yes, okay, that's fine. And you would think after all the dinner time conversations I've had over the years that they would be a fiscal conservatives, right? They would be right of center. I've got my older son. It was kind of funny. I wrote about this in one of my newsletters. I get this. He started his first real job. He's a commercial pilot, and I'm really proud of the kid. Because he worked hard to become a commercial pilot. But I get this phone call frantically one day. Dad, I think they made a mistake. Look, what is this thing of CPP and tax? I kind of understand, but what is this stuff? They took off a good chunk of money. That's got to be a mistake. I said, send me your pay stub. So of course he texted me his pay stub. Bang on, it's right. And so the phone call was like this: son, love you. Welcome to the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've had very similar conversations with my second youngest son as well. But in any event, it was I think it takes time like that when all of a sudden it becomes real and it hurts you in the pocketbook, and then you stand back and think, what am I paying for? What I'm paying for, all this, stuff that is not real to me.
Yeah,
not important to me. So
I think a lot of people philosophically get tied up in a certain ideal, and then, like you said, until the reality of the situation really crystallizes their knowledge or their understanding, they only understand it from a purely theoretical standpoint, and it really doesn't hit home until it actually hits them, to use your terminology, in the pocketbook. And that's an unfortunate thing. I have seen, I have similar experiences with other people who were the same way. It's another pet peeve of mine. People who talk out of one end of their mouth about complaining about how much they have to pay, but on the other hand, they go and they support a lot of the fiscal policies that result in the high taxation and the high cost of living and everything. And it's a very frustrating situation to be in. I think one thing that I learned over the pandemic, and that I wish more people would take away from that awful experience, is the scientific rigor and scientific methodology of, you got to have strong beliefs that are loosely held. And loosely held in the sense that you've got to be willing to challenge everything that you believe, and only hang on to what fact will substantiate. And if there is new information that is proving your existing beliefs incorrect, then you need to adapt. And I think that's something that not a lot of people do in a polarized society that we have as we do today.
That's well said.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, that's well said. Kim, your anecdote reminds me of the famous, and I believe it was Sir Winston Churchill, who said, "He who is not a liberal before the age of 30 hath no heart. He who is not a conservative after the age of 30 have no brains.
But it's interesting how, being a fiscal conservative is just so polarizing. Like to me, it's just common sense. Like,
of course.
But in any event, it's,
well,
I love how.
Part of the issue, I think, is incentives. Incentives in our political world are misplaced. So politicians are incentivized to spend money because it's not their money they're spending future generations' money, and there's no penalty for doing that, or at least the penalty is deferred for a number of years until they qualify for their parliamentary pension. Whereas, and also the graduated income tax rate is a disincentive or is an incentive for them to spend money that they don't have. But this is where I believe something like the GST or consumption tax makes more sense. If we shift our tax burden from an income tax system to a consumption tax system, then you get a buy-in from everyone in society, whether you earn $40,000 a year or $400,000 a year. Everyone's incentivized to keep the government accountable and say, hey, what are you going to do to cut my taxes? Because I don't like paying this 25% consumption tax.
Yeah. Now, I think that's a good place to pause for now, because I think we're going to start getting into budgets and how budgets matter. And so, Kim, we're going to take a quick break here. I'm going to throw it back to Bill, and we're going to continue this conversation on the other side of the break here. So, Bill, I'll leave it to you to take it away.
No, I'm loving this conversation. And unfortunately, I'm not participating in it. I'm sitting here screaming, fair share, fair share. What is fair share? Budgets matter. I'm like losing my mind because Canadians and Americans have a lot more in common than we think we do. Okay. We're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to get into the issue of spending and how it makes a difference. And the fact that, as you just teased, their budgets do matter, especially how you compile and use your budgets and your incentives. Guys, as we take this break to go off, let me just quickly, Alex, John, for those who are listening to this conversation who think, I'd like to talk to those two guys. What's the best way for listeners to get a hold of you?
Best way is to send us an email at info@medwealth.ca. That's info@med-wealth.ca, or go to our website, which is medwealth.ca.
Beautiful. All right. Don't forget, part 2 is coming up. You want to be here for that. And the best way to do that is, if you are not a subscriber already, hit the follow button, become a subscriber. That way, when episode 2 drops, you'll be notified and you can listen right away. And you can spread the good news, if you will, by sharing it. If you like this podcast, word of mouth is always appreciated. Until next time, I'm Bill Tucker, thanking you on behalf of John and Alex and everybody at MedWealth. Thanks for listening. We appreciate it, and we'd remind you that you can go out today and make today a great day, or not. It's your choice. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.